And the state as being a machine of the dominant class for the oppression of all other classes. There was no state under primitive communism, but with the later division of labor and the rise of the exploiting class, the state arose as an instrument to exploit the exploited, and state officials soon became relatively independent, creating the erroneous impression that they form a class devoid of special interests, whereas actually, at each stage of society, the state and its officials are solidly lined up with the ruling class. This is also true of the Christian state, and especially of the bourgeois state, whose highest function is to protect the private property of the haves against the claims of the have-nots. However, with the increasing power of the proletariat, which forces the bourgeois class to yield it more and more political power, the bourgeois state alienates itself from the reality of modern society, with the imperialistic state as the highest phase of this alienation, until its continued existence becomes redundant and it is swept away in a proletarian revolution. Now, this revolution is immediately followed by the institution of the dictatorship of the proletariat, so-called, which is of vital importance to communist eschatology and figures very prominently indeed in the writings of Marx, Engels, and Lenin, as too did the Paris Commune, which they all regarded as a preview of such proletarian dictatorship. After the essential revolution, then, the bourgeois state is smashed and replaced by the dictatorship of the proletariat, in which private property in land is immediately abolished, socialist dictatorship is proclaimed over the production and distribution of all goods, all banks are confiscated, all businesses and trading is brought under socialist control, and inventories are drawn up of all the assets in the country, false declarations being punishable by a total loss of all property, as well as by imprisonment. This dictatorship of the proletariat, then, can be defined, and here I quote from Lenin, as power which directly rests on violence, which is not limited by laws or restricted by any absolute rules. It is essentially different from the old bourgeois state. The dictatorship is not yet socialism proper, but it is an essential link in the transition thereto, and it is invested with its own necessary tasks of revolutionary destruction and construction. It violently suppresses the bourgeoisie, but not the middle class, the town dwellers, but it does not suppress the peasantry. Because although it is centralistic, it is also supposed to be democratic. It may take on different forms in different countries, as long as it follows the general pattern of the Paris Commune, according to Lenin. But although democratic, the dictatorship of the proletariat is also centralistic. It actually amounts to the dictatorship of the Communist Party. For socialism is not anarchy. We need to recognize this. Communists may be in league with anarchists at the moment in seeking to overthrow the United States, for example, but right after the takeover, the communists will crack down on the anarchists. Nobody will defy the dictatorship of the proletariat, least of all the offbeat anti-establishmentarian hippies in the present situation. Socialism is not anarchy. Only under future communism will political coercion wither away completely. Hearty welcome to Dr. Killen. We're very thankful for his interest in this course and very pleased to have him here. Now, after socialism, future communism will arise. Future communism can only result after the socialistic countries have long since ceased to be encircled by aggressive capitalistic nations. Only after every nation in the world has itself become socialist and has itself undergone the dictatorship of the proletariat can any nation in the world, including the Soviet Union and Red China, proceed from socialism to post-socialistic communism, thus Joe Stalin. Frankly, there's a slight revision of Engels' doctrine of future communism, particularly the doctrine of the state, by Stalin and all post-Stalinists, even anti-Stalinistic post-Stalinists on this particular point. But anyway, this is the current teaching. Until then, every nation in the world has become socialist and established the dictatorship of the proletariat as its form of state. No country in the world, not even an iron or bamboo curtain country, can proceed from socialism to communism. Even the socialist state will itself grow stronger before it begins to grow weaker. And if you think that's nonsense, just remember what Karl Barth is teaching in the field of theology. When you mean no, you say yes, and vice versa. The way to destroy the state, the socialist state, ultimately, is to make it stronger and stronger and stronger, until finally, in a nonsensical dialectical leap, the state, a la Hegel, becomes an anti-state and a non-state. All of this you've got to trace back to Hegel. I think Francis Schaeffer is quite correct, where in one of his books he points out that all of this modern dialectic and basic rejection of things being identical to themselves and things being able to be, by a process of becoming, what they themselves are not at this particular point. This you can trace back to Hegel. Actually, more remotely, it goes back to Heraclitus. Heraclitus is the real villain of the piece, and it's significant, I think, that Lenin did very much research both into Hegel and into Heraclitus. Ferdinand Lassalle, who was a great leader in the German Socialist Party together with Karl Marx, wrote a book called Heraklit der Dunkle, Heraclitus the Dark One. And Heraclitus, now this is the fellow who said you could never put your foot into the same stream once, not only twice but once, because it's always moving on. He is the real root of the Hegelian dialectic as it works out in a great deal of modern theology around the person of Karl Barth and in communism too. I think it's quite significant that Barth never came out opposing himself strongly to communism. I'm not saying he was a communist, but he was far more anti-Nazi than he was anti-communist. This particular point, Emil Brunner was a little more sound in that he clearly recognized communism for what it was, an enemy of the gospel, and took appropriate stance over against it. Anyway, after the advent of worldwide dictatorship of the proletariat, and only then, will communism begin to develop. The first stage will be the establishment of a world Soviet Socialist Republic, followed by universal self-government of all of the world's inhabitants. Then the state will wither away, as too will government as such, and even democracy, because democracy is demos kratein, the people, the mob rule, kratein, but there will be no rule, not even of everyone, under future communism. There will be no rule at all. In fact, even the Communist Party will ultimately wither away. Namely, once everybody has become a communist, and then there will be freedom from politics, and all authority will be purely economic or associational. Thus Marx. Now, post-Leninistic communists claim that they have not deviated from this program. Stalin insisted on the necessity of successful worldwide revolution before the socialist state could begin to weaken. Khrushchev endorsed this general position in spite of his emphasis, after the advent of universally destructive atomic weapons, on the desirability of what he called peaceful coexistence. And by peaceful coexistence, Khrushchev and his successors mean conquest of the West by communism without war. This position, as well as that regarding the eschatological advent of universal stateless society, was later re-emphasized by contemporary Russian philosophers I've only done research up to about 1968 on their current thinking, but I think this is quite recent enough. Whereas the goal of ultimate statelessness has been underlined especially by the Red Chinese. Now then, what shall we say about this system of future political development as the communists see it? Well, I think that we should first admit that some of these goals are partially credible. I think we must concede that it is true that the state as we now know it is not a primordial institution, that the state does seek to moderate conflicting group interests, that hereditary rulers are a later development than was the institution of the state as such, that the state may abuse its powers, this is very true, and that imperialism, that is the extension of state control over a people, a nation other than your own, is anti-normative, should not take place. But I think we must also ask the communist to admit that there are many theoretical contradictions in his own theory of the state, such as the contradictions between what he believes was original mass government, the whole tribe of apes that became the first men governing together, and the original idea of class oppression, which was essentially statist. These two positions are not reconcilable. There's surely a contradiction between the communist idea that the bourgeois state dominated bourgeois society, and their other statement that bourgeois society produced the bourgeois state and dominated it. There's a contradiction surely between the communist view that the state will wither away shortly after the revolution and their other view that the dictatorship of the proletariat under socialism prior to the withering away of the state will last indefinitely. There's a contradiction between Marx's approval of the Paris Commune of 1871 and Lenin's idea of the Russian Revolution as it came to pass in 1917. There's a contradiction between smashing the bourgeois capitalist state on the one hand and between the idea of a proletarian state regime after that, and between whether this proletarian regime is of a state-like character or not. Is it essentially a state or an anti-state? They've never got clarity on this position. There is surely a contradiction between the communist theory of the dictatorship of the proletariat's oppression of the bourgeoisie and the kulak peasants, and the character of the dictatorship of the proletariat as an alliance between the proletariat and the non-proletarians. Contradiction between the dictatorship of the proletariat as predecessor of the socialist state on the one hand, and as being equivalent thereto on the other. Contradiction between the hegemony of the Communist Party over the people, or of the Communist people over the Communist Party. Contradiction between the control of the party from below on the one hand, and its control by the Central Committee above it on the other. Contradiction between the abolition of the political authority, so-called, and the expansion of a more despotic economic authority, which communists admit they will always have to have. Lenin wrote an interesting little essay of just 4 pages, very important essay, in 1874, I think it was, called On Authority. That is to say, on the necessity of future non-political, purely economic authority under future communism, in which he says that authoritarianism within the socialist factory will be much more dictatorial than capitalist political authority ever was. This is quite an admission. I think we also discover that communists begin to run into a number of practical problems as they seek to implement their program. This has been experienced by post-Leninistic communists regarding the state. For example, the present existence of the Soviet state, in terms of its communistic definition, implies seeing it still a state, and a state is by definition a class group that subjects every other class, it implies then that the Soviet proletariat, peasantry, and intelligentsia are right now being oppressed by the Communist Party. Also, they've run into the problem in trying to apply communism, or rather socialism before communism, that the better than average economic conditions of Communist Party functionaries behind the Iron Curtain, as over against non-card carrying members of the Communist Party behind the Iron Curtain, must imply, in terms of strict communist theory, that Communist Party members behind the Iron Curtain are the new dominant class and the new oppressive government of the non-party members. That the new so-called socialist government is forcibly proletarianizing the peasants, and if it's doing so forcibly, it must therefore be doing so statistically. That because the Soviet leaders have been forced to maintain the Soviet state for reasons of internal security, they have had to revise Engels' own doctrine of the state regarding the conditions necessary for its withering away, and that there is still no sign at all of the withering away of the Soviet state, even though Stalin and Khrushchev, who stated that this was happening, have themselves withered away. Getting to be a little more critically of the communistic theory of the state, I think we should note that the Marxists have nowhere analyzed the essential structure of the state as such. I don't very frequently quote Doerheert with approval, but on this particular point I believe he's almost in the bull's eye. I think he has a very intelligent doctrine of the structure of the state. I refer you to the New Critique. So pleased to see that just about all of your professors here in the campus have got the New Critique on their bookshelves. I'm sure that they'd give you access to it if you desired. There is also no firm evidence that the original government, after man is supposed to evolve from an ape, was one of matriarchy, government by women over men, as Friedrich Engels himself claimed in his book, The Origin of the State and the Family and Private Property. At this stage he was following Bachhofen and the American redskin expert Lewis Morgan. Sociologists, anti-Christian evolutionistic sociologists from about 1900 onwards have completely rejected by and large the theory of original matriarchy, but reactionary as the communists are, they still cling to the outworn 1870, 1880 theories of primordial matriarchy. They haven't done much updating there. It's a very painful point to press a communist on this particular aspect. I think we must criticize them that the state is not an economically qualified entity. The state is politically qualified, not economically. There is no merit, as Lenin says there is, in a state being large just for the sake of bigness. Some big states like Red China run a lot less efficiently than are some small states such as Luxembourg, which is quite a well-governed state, and conversely too. Some large states such as the United States of America is run a lot better in my judgment than the state of Upper Volta in Africa, which has 1 mile of it's 4 miles of macadamized road from the international airport to the President's Palace, and that's it. It's a tiny state that you could almost drop into this particular county of Mississippi. So size has got nothing to do with ability. Incidentally, gentlemen, living in the United States, you must be very careful before you assume that all big churches will necessarily be worse than our small churches. I know in your situation it often is the case, but where I come from, the largest church in the country, of which I'm a minister, but I'm not just saying this because I'm a minister of the church, is the most conservative. Our smallest historical church, which has only 10,000 members, the Congregational Church, is the most liberal. So a thing isn't necessarily bad because it's big, or vice versa. Same goes for the size of countries. Further, the proletarian state under socialism has not really sought to moderate various interests of different groups of society, but has deliberately set out to oppress all non-communizable elements. To this extent, it hasn't been a true state at all, quite apart from its de jure derivation, but de facto it has been acting as an anti-state while claiming to be a state. Marx's description of the atheistic state, the state which is confessionally atheistic and indifferent to God or even opposed to God as being the perfect state, is quite absurd. The politically governmentalistic demand of actively involving every worker in every member administration, that is to say that every person in the country must at some time or another perform some sort of political office, is theoretically absolutistic and nonsensically inapplicable in practice. Also, as a Christian, I would object to women ever getting involved in positions of political authority in government at any level. But on this point, I admit I'm prejudiced. That proletarian centralism and one-party dictatorship is irreconcilable with freedom. That it hardly appears likely that the proletarian state will ever wither away of its own accord. That the non-political future associations, which even communists say must ultimately replace the state, there will be order, there will be authority in society after the state is withered away, but these will be non-political associations. They will control traffic and machinery, for example, under a perfect communist world, would, according to Engels' own admission, quote, be more despotic than capitalistic government ever was, unquote Engels. That it is nonsensical, surely, to speak of strengthening the socialistic state in order to abolish it at a later stage, thus Stalin, and that Trotsky's and Khrushchev's descriptions of life under the Leninistic proletarian state, and particularly the Stalinistic proletarian state, makes the bourgeois state with all of its faults seem considerably more attractive. Khrushchev, in fact, even admitted this. Now then, our own Christian view of the state is anchored in the triune God, the King eternal, the ruler of the universe, the appointer of all human governments, and the judge of all the earth. Proverbs 8:15 and 16, by me kings reign, and princes decree justice. By me princes rule, and nobles, even all the judges of the earth. Without teaching any kind of subordinationism within the ontological Trinity, I think we must recognize that Scripture does teach that the Son willingly subjects himself to the Father. He is co-equal with the Father, but his function as a Son is to obey the Father and to willingly execute whatsoever the Father hath foreordained. You know the interesting exegetical problems that you run into regarding 1 Corinth 15 that the Jehovah's Witness always throws at you, the eschatological teaching there, that at the end of time the Son shall himself subject himself to the Father so that God shall be all and in all. Well now, as doctrinaire Calvinists we say yes, but when it says Son there, it means Christ according to his human nature, when at the end of time he divests himself of his human subordination to God the Father. This is Calvin's own comment on this. It says perhaps a little more than what the Scriptures themselves teach, but Calvin said, and from that point onwards, God the Son will no longer be subjected to God the Father, but by subjecting his human nature, he will then shine forth as auto theos, the Son being himself God, over against the Father, and will shine resplendently with that pure divinity, independently of the Father, which he had even before creation. Well, I agree, this is true, but although Christ will lay aside the subordination involved in his incarnation, some would even go as far as to say that Christ will one day lay aside his humanity, and that this is the implication of what Calvin taught. But if you teach this as Van Ruler is now teaching it in Holland, you get into problems with Chalcedon, that the two natures of Christ are conjoined to one another indivisibly. Once you've conjoined them, you can never separate them. I'm just pointing out to you some of the exegetical problems we get into when we try to think this thing through. But let me say this, that if we are to hold to what the Word of God itself teaches, quite apart from our doctrinal pro-Trinitarian, anti-subordinationistic a prioris, I think we must concede that it does say that the Son will subject himself, and that God will then be everything and in everyone. Well, the least that we can derive from this, without in any way diminishing the essential deity of the Son or of the Spirit, is, I think, that there is some sort of government within the Trinity of an ontological nature whereby the Son accepts the rule of the Father. In a certain sense, we can say that the Father is the Godhead. The entire Church Catholic agrees that while there is no sub-order within the Trinity, there is an order. Only the Father is the first person of the Trinity. The Son is not the first person of the Trinity, neither is the Spirit. The Spirit proceeds from the Father and from the Son, and in that order, not from the Son and then from the Father. First from the Father, then from the Son. The Son does not proceed from the Spirit. Still less does the Father proceed from the Son or the Spirit. So there is an order of government within the Trinity, although no subordination. Now I hope we've understood one another, and that you will not accuse me of any kind of high Arianism, such as is frequently alleged that John Milton held. I am not an Arian, I am a Trinitarian. But I think we can hold to order within the Trinity without in any way applying subordination. What does this teach us about government? Well, God created man in his image. The triune God, with order within the Trinity, created man and mankind within his image, creaturely resembling God in perfect righteousness or law-abidingness, and gave man the dominion chartered to subdue the earth. This presupposes the subjection of the earth and the structural arrangement of developing mankind into communities and nations in a decent and irregular order. I'd like for you to look at the closing chapters of Boswell's Systematic Theology, Volume 1 of this. I think it develops this very nicely from a strictly exegetical point of view. Now, if man had remained essentially righteous, there would, of course, have been no sin and no punishment of sin, and therefore no coercive, quote, state, unquote, with the punitive power of the sword. Yet I submit that precisely man's righteousness and his execution of the dominion charter, Genesis 1:28, would have led to a political order regulating group interests even if sin had never occurred. If man hadn't fallen, would he have built automobiles? Surely. Would there have arisen traffic ordinances to regulate stop streets, parking places? I am persuaded that this would have come to pass. Certainly there is a non-political governmental authority in the male's leadership role in marriage, clearly stated before the fall. So, by implication, should there not also be implied the development of state governmental authority? There is also the leadership role of the parents within the family over the children, even before the fall. Man was never omniscient, and it seems to me that even political though non-coercive governmental authority before the fall, as I said before, to regulate traffic, for example, would have developed in respect of the developing groups of men, even had man never fallen at all. Just as there will undoubtedly be a theocratic government, this is the way in which continental Calvinism puts it, there will be a theocratic government on the ultralapsarian new earth to come. Or, as other Calvinists may put it, if not a theocracy, then a Christocracy, but nevertheless a more direct Christocracy than we have at the moment, but nevertheless making means of human tools. After all, God's word says that on the new earth to come the kings of them that are saved shall walk in the heavenly light thereof and bring the honour and the glory of the nations into the heavenly city. So there will be order, governmental order on the new earth. Now, without speculating, and I realize we're painfully close to speculating, I would further just like to add that there is no reason to assume that such a political government that would have come into being even if man had never fallen would have been a democracy in the sense of one human being, one vote. Certainly babies and children would hardly have had a specifically political say in the world before the fall, and I'm inclined to doubt whether women would have had the political say either. Certainly women, if they had had the vote, had man not fallen, would not have played any political leadership role. They would have helped their husbands and been a helpmate meet unto them. I believe that it's legitimate to look at Proverbs 31 on this point as to a woman's role, even though I must recognize that Proverbs 31 is written in an infralapsarian setting after the fall has taken place. Even as, in my judgment, and you may be mad at me for saying it, but I'm still going to say it, women should not now play any leadership role in the government of the church. I believe this is wrong and sinful in the sight of Almighty God. That supralapsarian political government, then, the political government you would have had sin not taken place, I submit, would have been a theocracy. God would have ruled, with God-fearing and knowledgeable mature males eligible to choose suitably gifted persons from their own number to administrative positions under God. The possibility of the fall was already foreshadowed in the supralapsarian threat of the death penalty before the fall. Few people seem to have realized this, to say, well, the stake proceeds from Genesis 9. He that kills a man by man shall his blood be shed. One moment. Did God not say before the fall, Adam, if you eat of the fruit of this tree, you shall surely die? So I think we've got to go a little further back than Genesis 9. I'm aware of the fact that most Calvinists, probably even Calvin himself, have made the point-blank statement that the state could not in any sense have come into being had man not fallen, but I beg to submit that they were wrong, and that on this point, myself, being a minority of Calvinists, are right, and the rest of the Calvinists who thought otherwise, in my charitable judgment, have been less correct on this particular point. The possibility of the fall, I see, was already foreshadowed in the supralapsarian threat before the fall of the death penalty as the punishment for man's breach of the covenant. And after the fall, woman who had helped cause the fall precisely by seizing the governmental initiative from man, and God help the liberal church which is going to allow women to become elders and preachers today, it'll just be even the devil all over again. After the fall, woman was punitively subjected to man's domination, yet simultaneously woman was promised restoration, not to a position of co-governmental authority alongside of man, which she never had before the fall, but merely to her erstwhile glorious position of man's helpmate and co-heir, though by no means head over man, beyond the advent of the Messiah. This is why Paul, after the advent of the Messiah, can still say to women, now you keep quiet when you're in church. Man is to rule. God made Adam first and then the woman. If you have any questions, ask them to your own husband when you get home. But don't stand up and speak in tongues in church, particularly if you're a woman. This is inappropriate. It is a denial of God's leadership function by means of creation which he gives to the male sex alone. It was, of course, precisely after the fall and mankind's ejection from paradise by the sword-wielding angel of God, the cherub, that the state and the power of the sword became necessary to curb the iniquity of now fallen man, including the barbarous iniquity of the male sex towards woman. That awful man Lamech saying, "Hagar and Sarah, you listen to me. If a man or a boy as much as looks at me, I'll kill him." Now this is no way to speak to your wife, even if you only have one wife and not two, as Lamech had. You should treat your wife with great dignity, with great respect, precisely because she is the weaker sex, the weaker vessel, as Peter says, whether she is willing to concede this point or not. And so, God declared right after the flood, as the primeval death sentence on man's fall, that man himself may henceforth punish any man or beast who harms other men. Now then, this infralapsarian noarchic covenant, which so clearly roots in the supralapsarian Adamic covenant, in my judgment, one covenant in spite of different dispensations, this is often pointed to as the origin of the institution of the sword-wielding state. Dorotheus himself, quite remarkably, deliberately declines to express an opinion on this point. And his view, that a really Christian view of the state has its very starting point from the biblical view of creation, please note creation, not the fall, in my judgment seems to imply the construction of the infralapsarian sword-bearing state on the basis of the supralapsarian non-sword-bearing political governmental nucleus. In spite of Dorotheus' incorrect rejection of the Aristotelian view of the inherent naturalness of the non-sword-wielding state as such, which I myself would prefer to term political government as such, repudiating as I do the Aristotelian view of man's state as a necessary requirement of man's rational nature and as the leading governmental body in the integration of varying societal interests. On this point, I think Aristotle prepares the way for the advent of Aquinas for the advent of Roman Catholic political syndicalism, and from that Catholic socialism. It's very interesting to see how left-leaning these Catholic political parties of the world easily become, and how easily they cooperate with socialism, on account of the fact that they are still borrowing from Aristotle that the state is an essentially natural institution which has the function of coordinating art, science, religion, even all the way down the road. Of course, in Romanism this must be a Roman Catholic state. Nevertheless, be that as it may, I can certainly endorse Dorotheus' definition of the infralapsarian state as an internal monopolistic organization of the power of the sword over a particular cultural area within territorial boundaries, although there are some states such as Iceland where no arms are borne, not even by the policeman, which seem to militate against this definition. I believe that Dorotheus is a little more scriptural on this point than is Abraham Kuyper. There are elements in Abraham Kuyper regarding his theory of the state, valuable though they are, which should be subject to further reform in my judgment. Now then, it is clear from this definition that the state after the fall is grounded in the historical sphere, when the state concerned was founded at a certain point in man's history and qualified in the juridical sphere in the power of the sword, as clearly taught in the words of the institution of the Noachic covenant, in the words of Genesis 9, "Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God made he man. Surely your blood of your lives will I require. At the hand of every beast will I require it, and at the hand of man. At the hand of every man's brother will I require the life of man." This power of the sword is not only found in the law state, or the legitimate state of Romans 13, but even in a corrupted form in the power state, or the illegitimate state, or anti-state of Revelation 13. I think it's very interesting to note that the words of the Noachic covenant teach neither a popular democracy, a mobocracy, nor a monarchical tyranny, but a theocratic doctrine of the state. In Genesis 9, we are not told concerning the evildoer, by many men shall his blood be shed, nor are we told, here I disagree with Rushduni, nor are we told, by one man, by one monarch shall his blood be shed. We are merely told, by man shall his blood be shed, indefinite number of men. For in the image of God made he man. That's the rationale, a theocracy, although it is administered through lesser or greater number of men, acting in the name of God. The number of men involved in the punishment of the transgressor and the manner of their human appointment to this office is not discussed in the Noachic covenant, although it does seem clear to me from supralapsarian considerations, Adam ruling and not Eve, nor their children before they were mature, as well as from Moses' later appointment of a number of counselors as heads over the people. Exodus 18, isn't it? We'll deal with it in a minute. That a number of governmental representatives is the ideal. Not one, nor a mob, but a number. The point, however, is this. Not man, but God institutes the state and its officers, whether they're elected or appointed. And these officers ultimately derive their sword-wielding authority not from man or from the people, but from God, although it may be via the people. For this reason, the true state is a law state, a state legitimately appointed by God alone. Of course, the state's authority is for this very reason limited. The state is never the source of power. The state possesses purely derivative power from God alone. The state's power is limited to the political field alone. It consists solely in maintaining and promoting law and order and in harmonizing only the external juridical interests of the various non-state groups such as the church, the family, etc. The state has no right to meddle in the internal affairs of these non-state groupings, nor even in the internal juridical structure of non-political governmental authorities, such as marital authority or parental authority. When the state does this, it exceeds its boundaries given by Almighty God and degenerates into a power state. Romans 13 becomes Revelation 13, such as the proletarian state, the dictatorship of the proletariat. The first example of a power state in God's word is the imperialistic government of Nimrod at the Tower of Babel, which sought to defy God and to weld the whole world into one humanistic society. One man, one vote, one people, one language, one color, one religion, the religion of Antichrist. God destroyed this power state, and henceforth, as indeed required by the Dominion Charter, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, spread out and develop into different communities with different languages. Henceforth, I say, after the Tower of Babel, men were to form separate states in limited geographical areas, whereby all supranational states and or stateless cosmopolitanias stand condemned. Now, to Exodus 18, a fascinating passage. Moses' appointment of counselors to help him govern the people of Israel is full of wisdom, and in my judgment remains the ideal for all Christian statecraft. Quote, "Thou shalt provide out of all of the people able men, such as," this is the qualifications of a Christian politician, please listen, able men, not nincompoops, "such as fear God," not humanists, such as fear men, "men of truth, hating covetousness, and place such over them to be the rulers of thousands and rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s, rulers of 10s. This is the greatness of the American Constitution. It was Presbyterian in the field of the state all the way down. federal, state, county, municipal government, till we get down from the thousands to the hundreds to the 50s to the tens. And let them judge the people of all seasons. And it shall be that every great matter they shall bring unto thee, Moses, but every small matter they shall judge. So shall it be easier for thyself, Moses, and they shall bear the burden with thee. In other words, a decentralization of state power. If thou shalt do this thing, Moses, and God command thee so, then thou shalt be able to endure, and all this people shall also go to their place in peace. And Moses chose able men out of all Israel, and made them heads over the people, rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s, rulers of 10s, and they judged the people at all seasons. The hard causes they brought unto Moses, but every small matter they judged themselves. Conclusion: power should be delegated only to God-fearing and able and truth-loving and covetousness-hating officers over the central, provincial and local governments of the people, so that God alone may be glorified. Calvin himself says that the matter of government is largely indifferent, though he does have a slight preference for aristocracy, government by the best. He says, however, this aristocracy should be modified by popular government. In other words, not an hereditary aristocracy, but an aristocracy chosen by the people, but the people choosing the best people, not voting any kind of an idiot into office just so that everyone can get a chance to rule as the communists want. And then, of course, he says that these people are to defend the Constitution over against usurpation. Interesting passage in Institute's Book 4 at the end, where he points out that the Spartan, what are they called? Ephoroi, something like that, begins with an E. That they are to check and balance any monarchical tendencies of the Spartan king. This is Calvin. So you see what a great and wonderful constitution you Americans have. Just too bad that people in Washington don't always appreciate this. It is essentially biblical in the way in which it came into being. Perhaps that's why D.C. doesn't appreciate it as much as they should. Now then, as I wrote in my little book, Communism versus Creation, the principle of political authority antedated the fall. But it was only after the fall that the body politic was ordained by God as a law enforcing institution to check the spread of crime. The peace officer or political magistrate does not bear his sword in vain as an unused ornament. Send the murderer to the electric chair. Don't put it there as an ornament, but use it. For the magistrate is an active servant of God. Hence, Christianity acknowledges both the rights of the state to uphold law and order, to conscript soldiers, and to impose taxes for this purpose, Romans 13, as well as the duties of the state to maintain civic righteousness and protect the needy and to reward the good, Romans 13. During his earthly life, Christ himself taught the principle of subordination to the powers that be, and in his resurrection from the dead, his ascension and heavenly session, he triumphed over all principalities and powers, subduing the cosmos and demanding the Christianization of all persons and all governments, failing which they faced destruction, even as he announced in the Great Commission, "All power is given me in heaven and in earth." Of course, the devil, his children, and political governments and totalitarian anti-states under their control are right now putting up a stiff resistance to the triumphant advent of God's new political order of Christian government. But the ultimate defeat of the non-Christian forces and the triumph of even the political aspect of the kingdom of Christ, a Christocratic theocracy, is inevitable. Revelation 13 must succumb to Romans 13. Even as the heathen Nebuchadnezzar was forced to bless the Most High God and praise and honor him whose dominion is an everlasting dominion and whose kingdom is from generation to generation, so shall rulers like Governor Sergius Paulus of Cyprus, King Agrippa of Palestine be brought to submit to Jesus Christ, willingly or unwillingly, until the kingdoms of this world are become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be on his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor. Of the increase of his government and peace there shall be no end upon the throne of David and upon his kingdom, to order it and to establish it with judgment and with justice from henceforth even forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. But until this comes to pass, the Christian, if not yet enfranchised, is to be content until he is to be subject to principalities and powers, is to obey magistrates, is to be ready to do every good work. And when enfranchised, the Christian is to use his political privileges and gifts to God's glory, to seek to promote Christian statecraft, as did Joseph, did Moses, did Daniel. But Christians in all stations of life are to pray for kings and all those that are in authority, so that they too may be saved, and they too may glorify God in their callings. In Jesus' heavenly session, God has appointed him Lord and Christ, and he is reigning now on high until, working through his Spirit-filled earthly children, you and me, Jesus Christ subdues all his enemies under his feet as the footstool of his royal throne. We close. The Christian doctrine of the Christian state is diametrically opposed to that of communism. The Christian state derives its authority from God alone, not from the party or the proletariat. The authority of the Christian state is legally limited, not totalitarianly dictatorial. The Christian state regulates group interests and prevents oppression, not fosters it. The Christian state foreshadows and even now confesses the eschatological rule of Christ, whose kingdom shall never wither away. For your homework, Romans 13, and particularly Psalm 2.